Chapter 1. The Farm. Picture a boy, maybe 8 years old, standing in a barn in Marceline, Missouri. It's before dawn. His father is already awake, has been for an hour, and the work that needs doing will take until after dark. The boy's hands are small. The work doesn't care. Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago in 1901, but Chicago didn't last. His father, Elias, was a man perpetually convinced that success lived just beyond the next horizon, and so the family moved from Chicago to a farm in Marceline when Walt was 4, chasing a dream of pastoral prosperity that existed mostly in Elias's imagination. The farm was 45 acres. Elias had almost no farming experience. Walt would later remember Marceline as idyllic, a paradise of endless summer and animal friends. But memory is a kind of animation, isn't it? A way of redrawing the past until it looks like something you can bear. The reality was harder. Elias Disney was a difficult man. Some biographers use softer words: strict, demanding, old-fashioned. But Walt's older brothers, Herbert and Raymond, ran away from home as teenagers. People who run aren't running from strictness. They're running from something that makes home unlivable. Elias believed in discipline. He believed in the rod. Chapter 1. The Farm. Picture a boy, maybe 8 years old, standing in a barn in Marceline, Missouri. It's before dawn. His father is already awake, has been for an hour, and the work that needs doing will take until after dark. The boy's hands are small. The work doesn't care. Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago in 1901, but Chicago didn't last. His father, Elias, was a man perpetually convinced that success lived just beyond the next horizon, and so the family moved from Chicago to a farm in Marceline when Walt was 4, chasing a dream of pastoral prosperity that existed mostly in Elias's imagination. The farm was 45 acres. Elias had almost no farming experience. Walt would later remember Marceline as idyllic, a paradise of endless summer and animal friends. But memory is a kind of animation, isn't it? A way of redrawing the past until it looks like something you can bear. The reality was harder. Elias Disney was a difficult man. Some biographers use softer words: strict, demanding, old-fashioned. But Walt's older brothers, Herbert and Raymond, ran away from home as teenagers. People who run aren't running from strictness. They're running from something that makes home unlivable. Elias believed in discipline. He believed in the rod. He believed that children were born with wildness that needed to be beaten out of them, the way you might beat dust from a rug. Walt learned early that the world was not safe, that fathers could hurt you, that work was endless, and love was conditional, and the only place you could be free was inside your own head, where you could draw things differently than they were. He drew on the farm, on scraps of paper, on the sides of buildings, once on the wall of the house with tar, which earned him a beating he would remember for decades. He drew the animals, the pigs, the horses, the dog named Lady. In his drawings they smiled. They danced. They lived in a world where 8-year-old boys didn't have to wake before dawn and work until their hands bled. What he was doing, though he didn't have words for it yet, was creating an alternative. Not an escape exactly. Something more radical than that. A place where the rules could be rewritten entirely. When Walt was 9, Elias got typhoid fever. Then his brother Roy got it. The farm failed. Not slowly, quickly. The way dreams fail when they were never quite real to begin with. They sold everything. The family moved again, this time to Kansas City, where Elias bought a newspaper route. Not a small one, a massive route, over 3,000 customers, and Elias expected his sons to deliver every paper before school, in all weather, without complaint and without pay. Walt was 10 years old, waking at 3:30 in the morning, 7 days a week. In the winter, the temperature dropped below zero. His feet went numb in his boots. He delivered papers in blizzards, in ice storms, sometimes falling asleep in the stairwells of apartment buildings because he was too exhausted to make it home. Years later, he would tell people he never had a childhood. He wasn't being metaphorical. He meant it literally. The space where childhood should have been was filled instead with newspapers and his father's expectations, and the cold. But he kept drawing, in school, when he should have been paying attention, in the margins of his homework, on any surface that would hold a line. His teachers noticed. One of them asked him to draw patriotic pictures on the chalkboard. This was during World War I, and the country was drunk on nationalism and sacrifice. Walt drew Kaiser Wilhelm, the German emperor, as a pig. He drew soldiers, flags, eagles. The other students applauded. For maybe the first time in his life, Walt Disney felt something other than exhaustion. He felt seen. He started doing little performances, imitating Charlie Chaplin for his classmates, making them laugh. He was small for his age, with a gap between his front teeth and ears that stuck out. But when he made people laugh, none of that mattered. He discovered he could transform himself the same way he transformed blank paper. He could become someone else, someone people wanted to watch. At night, after the papers were delivered, after dinner, after whatever small freedom he could carve out of his father's expectations, Walt went to the Kansas City Art Institute. He was 14. The classes were for adults, but they'd let him in anyway, maybe because they saw something in him, or maybe just because he kept showing up. He learned to draw from life, to see shapes and shadows, to understand that everything, every face, every tree, every building, could be broken down into simpler forms and then rebuilt into something new. What he was learning, without quite knowing it, was that reality was negotiable, that the world as it was didn't have to be the world as it would be, that suffering could be transformed, redrawn, made into something bearable or even beautiful. This was the seed of everything that would come later. Not optimism exactly. Something more complicated. A belief that if you could control the image, you could control the meaning. But first, he had to get out. Away from his father. Away from the newspapers and the cold, and the feeling that his life was a trap he'd been born into. The world was at war. Boys were dying in France. And Walt Disney, 16 years old and desperate for transformation, saw his chance. Chapter 2. The Ambulance Driver. He lied about his age. This is important. Walt Disney was 16 in 1918, and the Red Cross required ambulance drivers to be 17. So he forged his birth certificate, changing the year from 1901 to 1900. It wasn't a big lie, just 1 year, just enough to slip through. But it tells you something about who he was becoming. Rules were suggestions. Reality was flexible. If the world wouldn't give him what he needed, he would simply redraw the world. His mother Flora helped him. She signed the papers. Maybe she understood that he needed to leave, that staying in Kansas City under Elias's roof would break something in him that couldn't be repaired. Or maybe she just knew that when Walt decided something, arguing was useless. He had his father's stubbornness, even if he'd never admit it. The same iron will, just pointed in a different direction. He trained in Connecticut, learning to drive the Model T ambulances, learning basic first aid, learning how to navigate roads that had been turned to mud by artillery and rain. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. Germany was collapsing. The Great Slaughter was running out of momentum. By the time Walt shipped out to France in November 1918, the armistice had already been signed. The war was over. He'd missed it. Some men would have been relieved. Walt was devastated. He'd wanted to see the war, to be part of something enormous and historical, to escape so completely from Kansas City that he'd come back transformed. Instead, he arrived in France to find soldiers packing up, preparing to go home. The great adventure already finished. But he stayed for a year. Driving ambulances wasn't glamorous once the fighting stopped. Mostly, it meant transporting supplies, moving equipment, occasionally ferrying wounded soldiers who were still dying from infections and complications, even though the bullets had stopped flying. Walt was stationed in Paris, then later in Germany with the occupation forces. He was 17, then 18, surrounded by men who'd survived something he'd only missed. He drew, constantly, on any surface available. He decorated his ambulance with cartoons, covering the canvas sides with illustrations and jokes. He drew for the other drivers, for the soldiers, caricatures and comic scenes that made people laugh. He discovered something important. His drawings had value. Not artistic value necessarily, though he was getting better. Social value, currency. A good cartoon could get you cigarettes, could get you invited to poker games, could make you memorable in a sea of forgettable young men far from home. He also discovered something darker, though he wouldn't talk about it much later. He saw what war did, not the glorious parts. He missed those, but the aftermath. The bodies that kept dying after the war ended, the men with faces half blown away, men missing limbs, men whose minds had shattered somewhere in the trenches and would never quite fit back together. The waste, the sheer stupid waste of it all. France itself was broken, villages destroyed, fields cratered, forests reduced to matchsticks. Walt drove through landscapes that looked like the moon, places where nothing would grow for years, where the earth itself had been poisoned by metal and gas and blood. He was young enough that it marked him. He came from a childhood that had taught him the world was hard, and France taught him the world was also fragile, that everything you built could be destroyed, that nothing was permanent except maybe the images you carried in your head. He found ways to make money. He drew fake insignias on soldiers' jackets, medals they hadn't earned, designs they wanted to bring home as souvenirs. He picked up German helmets from the battlefields. There were thousands of them, just lying there, and aged them artificially, shot them with bullets or roughed them up to make them look more authentic, then sold them to soldiers who wanted proof they'd been through worse fighting than they had. It was a con, but a harmless one. Everyone knew what they were buying. Memory, not truth. The story they wanted to tell about themselves. When Walt finally came home in 1919, he was 18 years old. He'd been gone a year. Kansas City looked smaller. His father's newspaper route looked like exactly what it was. A trap, a small life, a future of waking before dawn until you died. Walt had seen Paris. He'd seen men die. He'd seen how fast the world could change, how completely. He knew he couldn't go back to delivering papers. He couldn't go back to being his father's unpaid labor. He needed something else. He found a job at a commercial art studio, Pesman Rubin, doing drawings for advertisements, catalog illustrations, theater programs, anything that paid. The work was fine. The pay was terrible, but it was a start. And it was there, at Pesman Rubin, that he met a man named Ube Iwerks. Ebe, everyone called him. Quiet, brilliant, a technical genius with a pen. Walt could dream. Ube could execute. They became friends immediately, the way young men do when they recognize something in each other. A hunger, an ambition that doesn't fit inside conventional spaces. They were both fired after the Christmas rush, when the studio didn't need them anymore. So they did what Walt was already learning to do when the world didn't cooperate. They started their own company, iWorks Disney Commercial Artists. They were 19 years old. They had almost no clients. The company lasted exactly 1 month before they both had to find real jobs to survive. But the pattern was set. Walt Disney had learned that you could create your own opportunities, that if the world wouldn't give you what you needed, you could build it yourself. He just hadn't learned yet how many times he'd have to build it. how many times it would collapse, how much he'd have to lose before he found something that couldn't be taken away. He had no idea that in 3 years he'd lose everything he built, that someone would steal his work, his money, his company, and leave him with nothing but a train ticket and the beginnings of an idea that would change everything. But to understand how he got there, you have to understand what he found next. Not just animation, something deeper. A belief that he could make things move, that he could take drawings, lines on paper, nothing more, and give them life. Chapter 3. The First Studio. Walt found work at the Kansas City Film Ad Company in 1920. It wasn't what it sounds like, not glamorous, not Hollywood. It was a small operation that made primitive animated advertisements for local movie theaters, 60-second cartoons selling bread, selling cars, selling whatever local businesses would pay for. The animations were crude. Cut-out figures jerked across the screen. But Walt had never seen anything like it. He watched the cameraman, watched how individual drawings, photographed in sequence, created the illusion of movement. It was magic, but mechanical, technical, something you could learn. He stayed late after his shifts, experimenting with the camera, teaching himself the principles. Draw a figure, photograph it, move it slightly, photograph it again. 24 frames per second. Do it enough times, and the drawings lived. This was the thing that hooked him. Not drawing itself. He'd been drawing for years. But this, making things move, taking static images and breathing life into them. It felt like power, like he'd discovered a way to play God in miniature. You could make a character do anything, walk, run, dance, fly. The only limits were your imagination and your patience. Walt had plenty of imagination. Patience he would have to learn. He borrowed a camera from the company, started making his own experiments at home, in a garage he rented. He made short animated films, 1 or 2 minutes long, about Kansas City issues, potholes, traffic, local politics. He called them laugh-ograms, and he sold them to a local theater. People liked them. They actually laughed. Walt was 20 years old, and he'd found the thing he was good at. More than good at. The thing that felt like it had been waiting for him. In 1922, he quit his job and started his own studio, Laugh-O-Gram Films. He convinced a group of local investors to put up money. He hired animators, including UBI Works, who was still the best artist Walt knew. They rented office space in downtown Kansas City. For the first time in his life, Walt Disney was running something, building something. He had a company with his name on it, employees, projects, a future that looked like it might actually work. They made cartoon versions of fairy tales, Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Cinderella. The animations were crude by later standards, but they were charming. They had personality. Walt was learning how to tell stories, how to time jokes, how to make audiences care about drawings on a screen. He was also learning how to run a business, which meant he was learning how to fail at running a business. The money ran out, not slowly, quickly. Walt was better at spending than earning, better at imagining projects than managing budgets. He signed a deal with a distributor in New York to make a series called Alice's Wonderland, a hybrid of live action and animation, a real girl interacting with cartoon characters. It was ambitious, expensive. The distributor promised payment. Walt hired more animators, rented equipment, spent money he didn't have yet on money he assumed was coming. The distributor went bankrupt. The money never came. Walt couldn't pay his employees, couldn't pay his rent. The studio collapsed in 1923. He was 21 years old. He'd been in business for less than a year. He had to let everyone go. Had to close the office. Had to admit to his investors that their money was gone. He was a failure. Again. He did odd jobs to survive. Took photographs. Made a film for a local dentist about oral hygiene. shooting footage of a child's mouth, trying to make it educational and not horrifying. He lived in the studio office for a while, sleeping there because he couldn't afford an apartment. He ate cold beans from a can. There was a family of mice living in the office. Walt didn't kill them. He was lonely enough that mice felt like company. He started to tame one, feeding it scraps, letting it run across his desk while he worked late into the night on projects that no longer had any hope of paying him. Kansas City felt like a trap again, the same trap his father had been caught in, just in a different shape. Walt could see his future if he stayed. Small jobs, small dreams, slow suffocation. His brother Roy was in California, recovering from tuberculosis in a veterans hospital. Walt had $40 left. He bought a train ticket to Los Angeles, first class, which was insane given his situation, but he wanted to arrive looking like someone, not like the broke 21-year-old failure he actually was. On the train, he played poker. Lost. Got his last $40 stolen by someone cheating at cards. Arrived in Los Angeles in July 1923 with no money, no job, no prospects, just a single suitcase with one change of clothes and a print of that Alice's Wonderland film he'd never finished. He was starting over. Again. But this time he was doing it in a place where starting over was practically the local religion. California was different. The light was different. The air was different. Everything felt possible in a way Kansas City never had. The movie industry was exploding. Studios were everywhere. Walt tried to get work as a director, as an actor, as anything. No one was interested. He was nobody from nowhere with nothing to offer. So he did what he always did when doors closed. He built his own door. Chapter 4. The California Gamble. Roy Disney was 29 years old, thin from tuberculosis, just out of the veterans hospital, when Walt showed up talking about starting another animation studio. Roy was the older brother, the practical one, the one who understood money and budgets, and all the boring parts Walt hated. He'd already bailed Walt out before, and here was Walt again, broke, asking for help with another dream that would probably fail. Roy said yes. Maybe because Walt was his brother. Maybe because Roy had been sick for so long that the idea of building something, anything felt better than the alternative. They borrowed money from their Uncle Robert, $250. They set up shop in Uncle Robert's garage on Kingswell Avenue in Hollywood. The garage was tiny, 10 feet by 12, but it had electricity and space for a camera, and that was enough. Walt wrote to a New York distributor named Margaret Winkler. She'd been distributing cartoons for other studios, and Walt pitched her on Alice's Wonderland, that hybrid series he'd started in Kansas City, live-action girl in a cartoon world. He sent her the test film. She wrote back. She was interested. She offered a contract. $1,500 per cartoon. A series of 12. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. It was oxygen. Walt needed a girl to play Alice. He found one through a local casting call. Virginia Davis, 4 years old, dark hair, expressive face. Her parents agreed to let her work for the studio. Walt needed animators. He wrote to everyone he'd worked with in Kansas City. Most said no. UB Iwerks was working steadily. Didn't want to risk another Disney venture. But a few came. Young men willing to gamble on California, on Walt, on the idea that animation might be more than advertisements and novelties. They called the company Disney Brothers Studio. Not just Walt. Brothers, Roy insisted. He was putting in as much as Walt, managing the money, handling the business side, and he wanted recognition. Walt agreed, though you could tell it bothered him. Not because he didn't love Roy, because Walt was already thinking bigger than a brother's operation. He was thinking empire. But empires take time. The first Alice cartoons were rough. The animation was primitive. The stories were thin, but they had energy. They had charm. Walt was learning to direct, learning to time gags, learning how to make a 4-year-old girl act naturally in front of a blank white backdrop, while animators drew cartoon characters around her later. It was tedious work. Each cartoon took weeks. The money from Margaret Winkler came slowly, and there was never quite enough of it. But they survived. Month by month, cartoon by cartoon, they survived. They moved out of the garage into a small storefront, then into a slightly bigger space on Hyperion Avenue. Walt hired more animators. The studio grew. Not fast, but steadily. They were making enough cartoons to keep the distributor happy, making enough money to pay everyone, making enough progress that it felt like maybe this time it wouldn't collapse. Walt married. This matters, though he didn't talk about it much later. Her name was Lillian Bounds. She was an ink artist at the studio, one of the women who traced the animator's drawings onto celluloid, painting in the colors. She was quiet, practical, pretty. Walt was 24, and marriage meant stability. It meant he was a real person with a real life, not just a failed animator sleeping in offices. They married in 1925. Lillian would stay with him for 41 years, through everything that came next. Though you wonder sometimes what she thought during the worst of it, if she regretted hitching herself to a man who could never stop building, never stop risking, never stop reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The Alice series ended after 4 years, 56 cartoons. It had run its course. Walt needed something new. He created a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was different from Alice, fully animated, no live action, just a cartoon rabbit with long ears and a mischievous personality. Walt poured himself into Oswald, made him move with more fluidity than any of his previous characters, gave him attitude, made him feel alive. Margaret Winkler had gotten married by then to a man named Charles Mintz, and Mintz had taken over the distribution business. He liked Oswald, signed a contract for a series. Better money this time, $2,250 per cartoon. The Oswald cartoons were successful. Audiences loved them. Theater owners requested more. Walt hired more animators, expanded the studio, felt for the first time like he was building something that might actually last. Oswald was his. The character he'd created, the thing that was finally working. The studio was thriving. Walt was 26 years old, and he'd survived Kansas City, survived the garage, survived year after year of barely making it. He'd built a real studio with real success, and a character people actually cared about. He thought he'd finally figured it out. Thought he'd finally found the thing that couldn't be taken away. In February 1928, Walt took a train to New York to negotiate a better deal with Charles Mintz. He wanted more money per cartoon. The studio was doing well. Oswald was popular. It seemed reasonable. Walt thought he had leverage, thought he was negotiating from strength. Mintz offered him less money, not more. Less, $1,800 per cartoon, down from $2,250. Walt said no. Mintz smiled, told him it didn't matter what Walt wanted, told him he'd already hired away most of Walt's animators, offered them more money to leave Disney and work directly for Mintz, told him that Oswald didn't belong to Walt, that the contract Walt had signed gave Mintz ownership of the character, that Walt Disney had created Oswald, had made him successful, but that Oswald the Lucky Rabbit belonged to Charles Mintz, and if Walt didn't take the lower offer, Mintz would simply make Oswald cartoons without him. Walt had never read the contract carefully, had trusted that the thing he created was his, had believed that if you built something, it belonged to you. He was wrong. He'd built Oswald, and Oswald belonged to someone else. Most of his animators were already gone, already working for the man who'd stolen his character. Walt had nothing. Again. He sent a telegram to Roy, one sentence. "Everything okay? Coming home." Which Roy understood meant everything was not okay, meant disaster, meant starting over. Again. On the train back to California, Walt sat with Lillian and tried to figure out what came next. He was furious. Betrayed? Humiliated? He'd worked for years building Oswald into something people loved, and someone else would now profit from it. He had a studio with almost no animators. He had contracts he couldn't fulfill. He had a future that looked like his past. Another failure, another collapse, another reason to give up and get a regular job like a sensible person. Instead, on that train, he started sketching a new character. Not a rabbit, a mouse. He'd had mice in his Kansas City office, remembered them fondly. Those small companions during his loneliest nights. He started drawing a mouse with big round ears, oversized shoes, a personality that was part Charlie Chaplin, part Douglas Fairbanks. Cheerful but scrappy, innocent but clever. A character who lost everything but kept bouncing back. He was drawing himself. He didn't know it yet, but he was drawing the only thing that would be permanent, the only thing no one could steal. Not because it couldn't be copied, but because it would become so big, so everywhere, that trying to steal it would be like trying to steal the sun. But first he had to name it. Lillian was there on the train. Walt wanted to call the mouse Mortimer. Lillian hated it, told him it sounded too pompous, too formal, suggested something simpler, something friendlier. Mickey, she said. What about Mickey Mouse? Chapter 5. Oswald. Walt came back to California with almost nothing. UB Iveworks was still there. Loyal Ub, who'd turned down Mintz's offer, who'd stayed when almost everyone else left. They had Roy, who'd kept the business running. They had Lillian and a few other staff members who hadn't been poached. They had the studio on Hyperion Avenue. And they had this mouse Walt had sketched on the train. This character that didn't exist yet. Except as an idea, a few drawings, a name, Mickey Mouse. The name felt right the moment Lillian said it. Friendly, but not childish. Memorable, but not trying too hard. Walt started developing the character with Ub, refining the design. Big circular ears that were easy to animate, easy to recognize from any angle. White gloves, so his hands would stand out against his black body. Oversized yellow shoes, a long thin tail. The design was simple by necessity. They didn't have time or money for complexity. But the simplicity made him iconic. You could draw Mickey in a few quick lines, and everyone would know exactly who it was. They made 2 test cartoons, Plain Crazy and The Galloping Gaucho. Silent films, because that's what cartoons were in 1928. Mickey flew a plane, courted Minnie Mouse, got into scrapes and adventures. The cartoons were fine, competent, but Walt couldn't sell them. He took them to distributors in New York and Los Angeles, and no one wanted them. The market was saturated with cartoon characters, Felix the Cat, Oswald, dozens of others. Why would anyone pay for another mouse when they could have an established character? Walt was unknown. He'd just lost Oswald. He had no track record worth trusting. The studio was hemorrhaging money. They had no income. The Oswald contracts were gone. Walt and Roy were borrowing from family, from friends, from anyone who'd lend to them. Lillian's father helped. Uncle Robert helped again. They were weeks away from bankruptcy. Again, Walt was 26 years old, and he'd failed so many times that failing again almost felt like destiny. Like maybe he was just someone who built things that collapsed. Then he heard about sound. Warner Brothers had released The Jazz Singer the previous year, 1927, the first feature film with synchronized dialogue. It was revolutionary. It was terrifying to the industry. Silent film stars whose voices didn't match their faces were suddenly obsolete. Studios that had invested fortunes in silent film infrastructure were panicking. But Walt saw opportunity. No one had made a cartoon with synchronized sound. Not just music. Cartoons had been released with musical scores for years. But synchronized sound, where the actions on screen matched the sounds perfectly, where a character hit a piano key and you heard that specific note, where footsteps and the music and the dialogue all lined up precisely with what you were seeing. It hadn't been done because it was technically difficult, expensive, and most people thought cartoons didn't need it. Walt thought cartoons needed it desperately. Thought it was the only way to make Mickey Mouse different. The only way to make people notice. He convinced Roy they should gamble everything on sound. Roy thought he was insane. They didn't have money for a normal cartoon, let alone one with synchronized sound. But Walt was immovable. They would do it. They would make it work. They didn't have a choice. They made a third Mickey Mouse cartoon, Steamboat Willie. The story was simple. Mickey piloting a steamboat, making music with various objects and animals, annoying the captain. What mattered wasn't the story. What mattered was that everything made sound. Mickey whistled. The steamboat horn blew. A goat ate sheet music, and Mickey cranked its tail like a hurdy-gurdy, and the music came out. A cat's tail became a ukulele. A duck's mouth became a horn. The entire cartoon was organized around sound, around the joy of synchronized noise. They finished the animation. Then came the hard part, recording the sound, syncing it perfectly with the images. Walt went to New York to oversee the recording session. They didn't have equipment that could do what Walt wanted, so they invented it. They created a click track, a metronome system that would keep the musicians in time with the film. They tried recording the sound directly to the film strip. Failed, tried again, failed again. Walt was spending money they didn't have, running up debts, sleeping in cheap hotels, eating one meal a day to save money. The recording session was chaos, musicians struggling to stay in sync with the images. Walt in the recording booth, conducting, shouting instructions, watching the footage and listening to the audio and trying to make them match. They did take after take. Instruments kept falling out of sync. The timing was off by fractions of a second, which made everything feel wrong. Walt was relentless, made them do it again. Again. His perfectionism, which would become legendary, which would drive everyone around him crazy for decades. This was where it started. In a New York recording studio with everything on the line, refusing to accept anything less than exactly right. They finished. The sound worked. It was synchronized. It was magical. Walt rushed the completed film to a theater owner in New York. A small independent theater, the Colony, willing to take a risk on an unknown cartoon. Steamboat Willie premiered on November 18, 1928. Walt wasn't sure anyone would care. Wasn't sure the sound would work in a real theater with a real audience. Wasn't sure Mickey Mouse would be anything more than another failed character in a life full of failures. The audience loved it. Not politely, not with restrained approval. They loved it. They laughed at every gag. They responded to the sound, to the synchronization, to the sheer novelty of a cartoon that felt alive in a way cartoons hadn't before. Mickey wasn't just moving. He was making music. He was real in a way that silent cartoon characters could never quite manage. The theater owner immediately booked it for an extended run. Other theater owners heard about it, wanted it. Distributors who'd rejected Walt months earlier suddenly wanted to talk. Steamboat Willie made Mickey Mouse a star. Not slowly. Almost immediately. Within months, Mickey was everywhere, on merchandise, in newspapers, in theaters across the country. Walt Disney had finally created something that couldn't be taken away. Not because it was legally protected, though Walt would be much more careful about contracts from now on, but because it was too big, too popular, too embedded in American culture to be stolen by a single distributor. But success brought its own pressures. Suddenly, everyone wanted Mickey Mouse cartoons. Walt had to produce them constantly. 1 per month, then 2 per month. He had to hire more animators, expand the studio, manage production schedules and budgets, and distribution deals. He'd spent years trying to build something that worked, and now that it worked, it consumed him. Iwerks did most of the animation on those early Mickey cartoons. Ube could draw 600 drawings a day when he was moving fast, an inhuman amount of work. He was the technical genius behind Mickey's fluid movements, his personality, his life. But Walt got the credit. Walt's name was on the studio. Walt was the one doing interviews, promoting Mickey, becoming the public face of the mouse. It created tension. UB felt used, underappreciated. He was drawing Mickey while Walt was becoming famous for Mickey. In 1930, Ub left, started his own studio, backed by a competitor who promised him creative control and recognition. It was a betrayal, though not as complete as what Mintz had done. Ub genuinely wanted to create his own characters, his own studio. But it still hurt Walt, another person leaving. Another partnership dissolved. Walt had learned from Oswald that characters could be stolen. Now he was learning that people could leave even when you treated them well, even when you'd built something together. The studio continued. Walt hired more animators, made more Mickey cartoons, created new characters, Minnie Mouse, Pluto, Goofy, Donald Duck. Each one distinct, each one tested with audiences to see what worked. Walt was learning to build a roster, a stable of characters that could carry the studio if one faltered. He was learning not to depend on any single thing, any single person. But he was also learning something darker. That success didn't feel like he'd imagined. He'd thought reaching the top would feel safe, would feel like a rival. Instead, it felt precarious, like standing on a high wire knowing that one mistake, one failed cartoon, one shift in public taste, and everything could collapse. Again. He'd failed too many times to trust success, had lost too much to believe anything was permanent. Mickey Mouse was the most popular cartoon character in the world by 1932. Walt Disney was 30 years old. He'd survived poverty, betrayal, bankruptcy, theft. He'd built a studio that was thriving. He had money, fame, creative control. He should have been satisfied. He wasn't. He was already thinking bigger, thinking about what came next. Because standing still felt like dying. Because the moment you stopped innovating, someone else would innovate past you. Because Walt Disney had learned the hardest lesson of all, that success was just another kind of trap, unless you kept transforming it into something else. He started talking about making a feature-length animated film, a cartoon that ran 70, 80, 90 minutes. Something no one had ever done. Something everyone said was impossible. His staff thought he was crazy. His brother thought he was risking everything they'd built. His wife probably wondered if he'd ever be satisfied with enough. But Walt couldn't stop. He'd never been able to stop. The mouse had saved him, but the mouse wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something more ambitious, something that would either make him immortal or destroy him completely. Chapter 6. The Mouse. Mickey Mouse was everywhere by 1932, but Walt was already bored with him. Not publicly. Publicly, Walt loved Mickey, promoted Mickey, voiced Mickey in the early cartoons with that high-pitched, optimistic squeak. But privately, creatively, Mickey had become a problem. The audience loved him too much. Mickey had to be heroic, had to be good, had to always win. You couldn't make Mickey do anything too mean or too interesting, because the audience wouldn't accept it. Mickey had become a prisoner of his own popularity. So Walt started developing other characters who had more freedom. Pluto could be stupid and primal. Goofy could be clumsy and weird. Donald Duck, introduced in 1934, could be angry and selfish and jealous, could lose his temper and fail spectacularly, and audiences loved him for it. Donald felt real in a way Mickey couldn't anymore. Mickey had become an icon, which meant he'd stopped being a character. He was a logo, a corporate symbol, still profitable, still popular, but creatively dead. The studio was making money now, real money. Not just from the cartoons themselves, but from merchandise. Mickey Mouse watches, toys, books, clothing. Every product imaginable with Mickey's face on it, and Walt got a percentage of all of it. The Depression was crushing the country, banks failing, families starving, but people still bought Mickey Mouse products, still scraped together nickels to see Mickey cartoons. In some ways, that's what Mickey became during the Depression. Not just entertainment, hope. A character who stayed cheerful no matter what happened, who always bounced back, who represented the American fantasy that everything would work out if you just kept smiling. Walt understood this. Understood that Mickey had transcended animation and become something cultural, something almost political. But he also understood that cultural symbols were fragile, that the moment Mickey stopped being relevant, stopped evolving, the whole empire could crumble. So he kept innovating, kept pushing the animation forward, made cartoons in color when everyone else was still doing black and white, made cartoons with richer backgrounds, more elaborate gags, better stories. In 1932, Walt released a short called Flowers and Trees, the first full-color cartoon using the new 3-strip Technicolor process. It was beautiful. Lush greens and deep reds in colors that audiences had never seen in animation before. It won an Academy Award, the first Oscar ever given to an animated film. Walt was 31 years old, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had just told him that cartoons could be art, not just novelties before the main feature. He won again the next year for a cartoon called The Three Little Pigs. It was a simple story. 3 pigs build houses. A wolf tries to blow them down. But Walt infused it with character. Each pig had a distinct personality. The wolf was genuinely menacing. And the song, "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" became an anthem during the Depression. People sang it everywhere. It was defiant, optimistic, exactly what America needed. Walt had accidentally created propaganda, though he'd just been trying to make a good cartoon. The studio expanded. Walt hired more animators, trained them in new techniques. He started holding classes, bringing in art instructors to teach his staff anatomy, movement, acting. Because that's what Walt was realizing animation needed. Not just drawings that moved, but characters that acted. That felt like they were thinking, feeling, living. He studied live-action films, broke down performances, figured out how actors conveyed emotion through small gestures, and then taught his animators to do the same with drawings. It was working. Disney cartoons were the best in the industry. Everyone else was copying them. Competitors were trying to capture that Disney magic, but they couldn't quite figure out the formula. Because there was no formula, there was just Walt, pushing everyone harder, demanding more, never satisfied with good enough. He'd watch a cartoon the animators thought was finished and tear it apart, make them redo scenes, add more detail, change the timing, push the boundaries of what animation could do. His animators hated him for it sometimes. He was demanding to the point of cruelty, would reject weeks of work with a dismissive wave, would give contradictory notes, would change his mind about what he wanted, but they also respected him because he was usually right. The cartoons got better when they listened to him, won more awards, made more money. Walt had an instinct for what worked, even if he couldn't always articulate why. But short cartoons, no matter how good, had limits. They were 7, 8, 9 minutes long. You could only tell small stories, only develop characters so much. And Walt was thinking about something bigger, something impossible, something that would either revolutionize animation or bankrupt the studio trying. A feature-length animated film, 70 minutes, 80. A full story with character development and emotional arcs and real stakes. No one had ever done it. A few people had tried. Lotte Reiniger in Germany had made a feature-length silhouette film in 1926, but nothing with the full animation Walt was envisioning. and everyone in the industry thought it was suicide. Audiences wouldn't sit through 80 minutes of cartoons. Children would get restless. Adults wouldn't take it seriously. The animation would be too expensive to produce. It would never make its money back. Roy thought it was insane. They had a successful business making shorts. Why risk it? Why not just keep doing what was working? But Walt couldn't. He'd never been able to stay in one place. The moment something worked, he needed to push it further, see what else was possible. Standing still felt like dying. He settled on Snow White, the fairy tale, a princess, a wicked queen, 7 dwarfs, a prince. A simple story that everyone knew. But Walt wanted to tell it differently. Wanted real characters with real emotions. Wanted the audience to care about Snow White, to fear the queen, to fall in love with the dwarfs. Wanted animation that could compete with live-action films, not as a novelty, but as a legitimate art form. He started development in 1934. The budget was supposed to be $250,000, already a fortune for an animated film. Walt told Roy it would be fine. They'd recoup it easily. The film would be a hit. Roy didn't believe him, but couldn't stop him. No one could stop Walt once he'd decided something. The production consumed everything. Walt hired more animators. Over 100 people working on Snow White at the peak. They had to invent new techniques. Couldn't animate the way they did for shorts. Too expensive, too slow. So they developed the multiplane camera, a device that could shoot different layers of artwork at different depths, creating an illusion of 3-dimensional space. They studied live-action footage of actors to get the human movements right. They spent months just on character design, trying to make Snow White look appealing, but realistic, trying to make the queen beautiful and terrifying. The budget exploded. $250,000 became $400,000, then $600,000, then more. Walt kept adding scenes, kept demanding retakes, kept pushing for perfection. Roy was frantic. They were borrowing money from Bank of America, mortgaging everything. If Snow White failed, they'd lose the studio, lose everything they'd built. Walt didn't care, or couldn't care. He was too deep in it. Too committed. He'd staked everything on this film working. Hollywood called it Disney's folly, predicted it would be a disaster. A cartoon that long would bore audiences. Children would never sit through it. It was too dark, the queen trying to kill Snow White, sending her heart back in a box. Too expensive, too ambitious. Walt Disney was going to destroy his studio chasing an impossible dream. The film took 3 years to make. 3 years of 16-hour days. 3 years of Walt obsessing over every frame, every note of music, every line of dialogue. He acted out scenes for the animators, playing every character, showing them how he wanted the performances to feel. He was everywhere and nowhere, running between departments, checking progress, giving notes, changing his mind, changing it back. By the time Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs premiered in December 1937, the budget had reached nearly $1.5 million, an astronomical sum, 8 times the original estimate. If it failed, Walt Disney would be finished. He'd built an empire on a mouse, and he was gambling that empire on a princess. The premiere was at the Cathay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. Hollywood elite, filmmakers, actors, critics, everyone curious to see if Disney had created something revolutionary or if he'd just spent 3 years and a fortune on an elaborate failure. Walt sat in the audience next to Lillian. He was 36 years old. His hands were shaking. The lights went down. The film started. And within minutes, the audience was crying. Not just children, adults. Hardened Hollywood professionals. They cried when Snow White fled through the forest. They laughed at the dwarfs. They gasped when the queen transformed into the old hag. They were terrified during the climax, the queen falling off the cliff in the thunderstorm. When the film ended, the audience stood and applauded. It wasn't polite applause. It was stunned, genuine, overwhelming. Walt had done it. He'd made a cartoon that felt like a real film. That made people feel real emotions. That proved animation could be art. Snow White became the highest-grossing film of all time up to that point. Made $8 million in its initial release, an unimaginable sum during the Depression. Won a Special Academy Award, 1 regular Oscar, and 7 miniature ones, presented by Shirley Temple. Played in theaters for months, made Walt Disney famous not just as the cartoon maker, but as a filmmaker, an innovator, a genius. He should have felt vindicated, triumphant. He'd risked everything and won, proved everyone wrong. But Walt didn't feel triumphant. He felt exhausted. And already, even before Snow White finished its theatrical run, he was thinking about the next one, about Pinocchio, about Fantasia, about Bambi. Because success wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of higher expectations, bigger budgets, more risk. He'd climbed one mountain and immediately saw 10 more. The mouse had saved him. The princess had made him immortal. But immortality, Walt was learning, came with a price. You couldn't fail anymore, couldn't be ordinary, couldn't ever stop climbing. And somewhere inside him, the exhausted part that had survived Kansas City and France and bankruptcy and betrayal, that part was starting to wonder if he'd ever be able to rest. Chapter 7, The Folly. The money from Snow White poured in through 1938 and into 1939, and Walt spent it as fast as it arrived. Not on himself. He still lived modestly, still drove himself to work every day, but on the studio, on expansion, on new projects, on the belief that Snow White wasn't a peak, but a foundation, the first step towards something bigger. He bought 51 acres in Burbank and built a new studio complex, a sprawling campus with multiple buildings, each dedicated to a different aspect of production. Animation buildings, ink and paint buildings, a building just for the camera department, a theater for screening dailies, a commissary where everyone could eat lunch together. It was a factory for dreams, organized and efficient. Everything Walt had learned about production made physical. The Hyperion studio had been cramped, chaotic. The Burbank studio was orderly, professional, a place where serious art could be made at industrial scale. But the new studio cost money. The expansion cost money. And Walt had 4 feature films in production simultaneously: Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi, Dumbo. Each one ambitious, each one expensive, each one reflecting Walt's belief that animation could do anything, could tell any story, could compete with the best live-action films Hollywood produced. Pinocchio was supposed to be easier than Snow White. They'd learned so much making the first film, developed techniques, trained animators, but Walt wasn't interested in easier. He wanted better, wanted to push the technology further. The multiplane camera effects in Pinocchio were more elaborate than anything in Snow White. The character animation was more sophisticated. Pinocchio himself was redesigned multiple times because Walt thought he looked too wooden, too puppet-like. Which was the point. He was a puppet, but Walt wanted him sympathetic, relatable. The budget for Pinocchio ballooned, nearly $3 million, twice what Snow White had cost, and Snow White had been the most expensive animated film ever made. Roy was terrified. They'd borrowed heavily to build the Burbank studio. Now they were borrowing more to finish films that might not recoup their costs. Walt promised they would, promised that audiences would love them, but promises didn't pay debts. Fantasia was even more ambitious. It wasn't a story. It was classical music visualized through animation. 8 segments, each one paired with a different piece of music. The Sorcerer's Apprentice with Mickey Mouse. The Rite of Spring showing the creation of Earth, and the Age of Dinosaurs. Night on Bald Mountain, with demons and darkness. Walt wanted to create something that would elevate animation into high art, something that would play in concert halls, not just movie theaters. Something that would prove cartoons weren't just for children. He collaborated with conductor Leopold Stokowski, recording the Philadelphia Orchestra, developed a new sound system called Fantasound, early stereo, speakers placed around the theater to create immersive audio. The technology was expensive and complicated. Most theaters couldn't afford to install it. But Walt didn't care about most theaters. He cared about the vision, about creating something that had never existed before. Bambi was quieter, but no less ambitious. An adaptation of an Austrian novel about a young deer growing up in the forest. Walt sent his animators to the Los Angeles Zoo, brought live deer into the studio, made them study animal movement for months. He wanted realism, wanted the forest to feel alive, wanted audiences to fall in love with these animals so that when the hunter came, when Bambi's mother died, the grief would be real. Children's entertainment had never tried to break hearts before. Walt wanted to break them. And then there was Dumbo, the smallest of the 4 films, the cheapest. A story about a baby elephant with huge ears who learns to fly. Walt greenlit it as a quick project, something that could be made for under $1 million, something that could bring in revenue while the expensive films were in production. Dumbo was supposed to be simple, economical, a return to the basics of good storytelling and appealing characters. But even Dumbo took longer and cost more than expected. Because Walt couldn't help himself, he'd review the animation and want more. Better. Would add sequences. The pink elephant's hallucination sequence in Dumbo is one of the most surreal, psychedelic pieces of animation Disney ever produced, and it was in what was supposed to be the cheap, simple film. By 1940, the studio employed over 1,000 people. It was the largest animation operation in the world, and it was bleeding money. Pinocchio was released in February 1940. It was beautiful. Maybe the most technically accomplished animated film ever made. Critics loved it, but it didn't make money. Europe had descended into war, and the European market, which had been crucial for Snow White's profits, was closed. American audiences liked Pinocchio, but didn't love it the way they'd loved Snow White. It made back its production costs eventually, but barely. It wasn't the hit Walt needed. Fantasia premiered in November 1940. It was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. Parts of it were transcendent. The Sorcerer's Apprentice sequence became iconic, but the film as a whole confused people. It was too long, over 2 hours, too experimental, too arty. Regular moviegoers didn't want to watch dinosaurs dying to Stravinsky. They wanted stories, characters. The Fantasound system meant the film could only play in a handful of theaters equipped for it. Fantasia lost money. Lots of money. The studio was in crisis. Walt had gambled everything on these films succeeding. And they weren't. The bank wanted its loans repaid. Roy was frantic, trying to manage cash flow, trying to keep the studio solvent. They had hundreds of employees, massive overhead. Films that had cost millions, but weren't earning it back. Walt had built an empire on the back of Snow White, and the empire was collapsing. In 1940, the studio went public, sold shares to raise capital. It was the only way to survive. But going public meant Walt no longer had complete control. He had to answer to shareholders, to a board of directors, to people who cared about profits more than art. It killed something in him. The studio had been his vision, his rules, his kingdom. Now it was a corporation, a business, something that had to make money or die. And his animators were angry. The studio had expanded rapidly, hired hundreds of new employees, promised them steady work and good salaries. But now there were layoffs. budget cuts. The animators who'd built Snow White and Pinocchio and Fantasia were watching their friends get fired. They were working longer hours for the same or less pay, while Walt built a fancy new studio and talked about artistic vision. Walt didn't understand their anger. From his perspective, he'd built this, had risked everything multiple times, had created an industry where there was none. These animators had jobs because of him, had careers because of him. And now they were complaining about salaries, about hours. He'd worked 80-hour weeks for years, had risked his own money, his own future. What had they risked? But the animators saw it differently. They saw a man who'd gotten rich off their work, who took all the credit while they did the actual drawing, who fired people casually when budgets got tight, but never seemed to suffer himself. Walt had always been the boss, but he'd been a benevolent boss when money was flowing. Now that money was tight, the benevolence was gone. What remained was just a boss, and bosses could be fought. A union organizer arrived at the studio in early 1941, started talking to the animators, started talking about fair wages, about job security, about credit for the work they did. Some of Walt's key animators joined. Art Babbitt, one of the best character animators, became a union leader. Walt felt betrayed. These were his people, his studio. He'd built this for them, with them, and now they were turning against him. The tension built through the spring of 1941. Walt refused to negotiate, refused to recognize the union, believed that if he gave in, he'd lose control completely. The animators felt ignored, disrespected. In May, they voted to strike. Chapter 8, The Factory. On May 29, 1941, roughly 300 Disney animators walked out. They didn't just quit, they picketed. Set up lines outside the Burbank studio with signs. Disney unfair to labor. Unionism at Disney will benefit the public. They marched, they chanted. Some of them had worked for Walt for over a decade, had animated Mickey Mouse, had brought Snow White to life. Now they were on the street, protesting against him. Walt took it personally, couldn't understand it any other way. These weren't workers fighting management. These were his people betraying him. He'd given them careers, had trained them, had built an entire studio around their talents. And this was how they repaid him? By embarrassing him publicly, by trying to destroy what he'd built. He gave a speech to the animators who'd stayed, the ones who crossed the picket line, told them the strikers were communists, that they'd been manipulated by outside agitators, that they didn't understand what they were doing, that the strike would destroy the studio, would put everyone out of work. He was angry, wounded. He believed what he was saying, believed the strike was a conspiracy against him rather than what it actually was. Workers who felt exploited asking for fair treatment. The strike lasted 5 weeks, all through June and into July. Production on Bambi and other projects slowed to almost nothing. The studio hemorrhaged money it didn't have. The press covered it. Disney's Magical Kingdom was revealed to be a workplace like any other, with labor disputes and angry employees and broken promises. The federal government eventually stepped in, mediated, forced Walt to negotiate. The strikers won most of what they wanted: better pay, job security, recognition of the union. But the victory felt hollow. The trust was gone. The family atmosphere Walt had tried to create, or thought he'd created, was exposed as an illusion. You can't have a family with hundreds of employees. You can only have a company. And in companies, workers and management have different interests. Walt never forgave the strikers. Art Babbitt, one of the strike leaders, was fired as soon as Walt legally could. Others were sidelined, given less important work, quietly pushed out. Walt became harder after the strike, more distant, less willing to know his employees personally. He'd been burned by intimacy, had thought of his animators as collaborators, as partners. and they'd revealed themselves to be employees, workers, people who could leave, could fight him, could prioritize their own interests over his vision. The strike changed him in ways that would affect everything he did for the rest of his life, made him more controlling, more suspicious, less willing to delegate creative authority. If people couldn't be trusted, then he had to control everything himself, had to make sure that nothing could be taken from him again. But even as the strike was being settled, something else was happening that would change everything. In Europe, Germany was at war with Britain. In Asia, Japan was conquering China. America was technically neutral, but clearly headed toward involvement. The world was consuming itself in violence, and that violence was about to reach across the Pacific and drag America into the fire. On December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, 5 months after the strike ended. America was at war, and suddenly, Disney's problems with unions and budgets and artistic ambitions didn't matter. The military mattered. The war effort mattered. Entertainment was now something else. It was morale. It was propaganda. It was a weapon. The Army moved troops onto the Disney lot the day after Pearl Harbor. They were protecting the Lockheed aircraft plant nearby, and the Disney studio was close enough to need defending. 700 soldiers camping on Walt's lawn, patrolling his buildings. The studio was militarized, conscripted, no longer entirely his. The government contracted Disney to make training films, educational cartoons for soldiers, films about aircraft identification, about proper rifle maintenance, about sexually transmitted diseases. Hundreds of films, not art, not entertainment. Information. Walt had wanted to elevate animation into high art. Now he was making cartoons about gonorrhea. But the military contracts kept the studio alive. Barely. Dumbo had been released in October 1941 and became a modest hit, made some money, helped temporarily. But Bambi, released in August 1942, underperformed. It was too gentle for wartime. Audiences wanted escapism or patriotism, not a sad story about a deer. The film lost money. Combined with the losses from Pinocchio and Fantasia, Disney was deeply in debt. So, Walt made propaganda. Der Führer's Face, a Donald Duck cartoon mocking Hitler and Nazi Germany. It was mean-spirited and effective, won an Academy Award, Victory Through Air Power, a feature-length film advocating for strategic bombing. Walt believed in the war effort, believed America was fighting for something important, but he also resented it. Resented having to make training films instead of art. Resented that his studio had been taken over by military priorities. He tried to keep feature animation alive during the war, made package films, collections of shorts bundled into features. Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros. These films were cheaper to produce, could be made with smaller teams, while most of his animators were overseas fighting or working on military contracts. They were fine, colorful, occasionally innovative, but they weren't Snow White, weren't what Walt had promised animation could be. The war years wore on him. He was in his 40s now, no longer the young dreamer who'd arrived in California with $40. He smoked constantly, drank more than he used to, worked long hours, but without the manic energy of his youth. He looked tired, felt tired. The strike had wounded him. The war had exhausted him. And the financial pressure never stopped. The studio was surviving, but not thriving. Every project had to be justified economically. There was no room for pure artistic vision anymore. Lillian worried about him. They had 2 daughters now, Diane and Sharon. A family. A home. But Walt was rarely there. He was always at the studio, always working, always trying to keep everything from collapsing. His marriage became more distant, not hostile, just separate. 2 people sharing a life but living in different worlds. Lillian raised the daughters. Walt built the company. they coexisted. When the war ended in 1945, Walt was 43. The studio had survived. He'd kept it alive through strikes and wartime and financial disaster. But something had been lost. The joy had been lost. The belief that animation was pure and magical and could save him. He'd learned that animation was a business, that magic could be monetized, that even dreams had to be profitable, or they died. He tried to recapture it, made Cinderella in 1950, the first traditional fairy tale feature since Bambi. The studio bet everything on Cinderella. If it failed, they'd have to shut down the animation division. It succeeded. Made money, saved the studio again. But the success felt mechanical, efficient. They'd figured out the formula. Princess, villain, animal sidekicks, songs. Audiences liked it. Shareholders liked it. Walt felt empty. He made more features. Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty. Each one successful. Each one technically accomplished. Each one feeling like repetition. He'd proven animation could tell feature-length stories. Now he was just telling them over and over. The animators were skilled, professional, efficient. They knew how to make Disney films, but nobody was innovating anymore. Nobody was pushing boundaries. They were manufacturing a product. Walt started spending less time in the animation building, started thinking about other things. Live action films, television. He produced Treasure Island, a live-action adventure film in 1950. It made money. He produced 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 1954. It made more money. Live action was cheaper than animation, less labor-intensive. And Walt discovered he enjoyed it. Enjoyed working with actors, with physical sets, with cameras. It felt fresh. Animation felt like something he'd already done. In 1954, Walt launched a television show, Disneyland, a weekly hour on ABC. It was promotional at first, a way to advertise the studio's films and projects, but it became something bigger. Walt hosted it himself, appeared on camera, talked directly to America's families in their living rooms. He was good at it. Warm, avuncular, trustworthy. Uncle Walt, people started calling him. He became more famous than Mickey, became the face of American wholesome entertainment. But inside he was restless. Television was fine. Live action films were fine. Animation had become routine. He'd built an empire, and the empire was functioning smoothly, and he was bored. Profoundly bored. Success had trapped him in repetition. He'd spent his youth fighting to survive, and now that he'd survived, there was nothing left to fight for except maintaining what he'd already built. He needed something new, something impossible, something that everyone would say couldn't be done. He'd proven animation could work, had proven television could work, had proven he could survive strikes and wars and bankruptcy. Now he needed to prove something else. He started talking about a park, an amusement park, but different. Better. Cleaner. More controlled. A physical place where families could experience Disney magic in 3 dimensions, where fantasy became real, where he could build an entire world exactly the way he imagined it, with no compromises, no strikes, no one telling him it couldn't be done. Everyone thought he was insane. Roy thought he was insane. Amusement parks were dirty, dangerous, filled with carnies and criminals. They were low class. Why would Walt Disney, who'd built a respected entertainment company, risk everything on a carnival? But Walt couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop sketching ideas, planning layouts, imagining what it could be. He'd built a studio, had built an animation empire. Now he wanted to build something you could walk through, something physical and permanent, a kingdom you could touch. He didn't know yet that the park would consume the last decade of his life, that it would become more important to him than animation ever was. that it would be the thing he was most proud of, and the thing that finally, maybe, gave him some measure of peace. But first, he had to convince everyone else it wasn't madness. And then he had to build it, in an orange grove in Anaheim, with money he didn't have, betting everything, one more time, on a dream that everyone said was impossible. Chapter 9. The Strike. Wait, we need to go back. Not to the beginning, but to the moment when everything Walt had built revealed itself to be something other than what he thought it was. The strike in 1941 wasn't just a labor dispute. It was the first time Walt Disney realized that the kingdom he'd imagined was actually a factory, and the people he thought of as family were actually workers who had their own dreams, their own needs, their own lives that existed independently of his vision. The signs carried by the striking animators were blunt, direct. I got the sack from Walt. Now I'm on the picket line. Are we mice or men? That second one was particularly cutting. A reference to Mickey Mouse, a question about whether Disney employees were characters in Walt's story or human beings with agency. Walt saw the signs. Saw people he'd hired, people he'd trained, people who'd eaten lunch with him in the commissary, standing outside his studio with grievances written in bold letters. Art Babbitt was the most visible strike leader. He'd animated Goofy, had developed that character's distinctive personality, the way he moved, the way he embodied lovable stupidity. Babbitt was one of Disney's best animators, and he was also the one Walt felt most betrayed by, because Babbitt wasn't a newcomer, wasn't someone who didn't understand what Walt had built. He'd been there. He'd been part of it. And now he was leading the rebellion. The strike wasn't spontaneous. It had been building for years. The animators had legitimate complaints. Pay inequity. Some animators made good salaries while others, doing similar work, made much less. No job security. Walt could fire anyone at any time for any reason. No screen credit for most animators. Walt's name appeared on everything. But the people who actually drew the films were anonymous. Long hours, especially during crunch periods. And an atmosphere of favoritism, where Walt's chosen few got the good assignments while everyone else scrambled. But what really drove the strike was something less tangible. A feeling that Walt saw them as tools rather than collaborators. That he took their work and called it his. That the magic they created belonged to him, and they were just interchangeable parts in the Disney machine. Some of this was Walt's personality. He was a controller, a perfectionist, someone who needed to be involved in every decision. But some of it was structural. The studio had grown too large for intimacy. You can't know 1,000 employees personally, can't treat everyone as special. Scale destroys closeness. Walt didn't see it that way. From his perspective, he'd given these people careers. The animation industry barely existed before he built it. He'd taken risks, financial, creative, personal, that his employees never had to take. He'd mortgaged his house, had borrowed from family, had nearly gone bankrupt multiple times. What had Art Babbitt risked? He got a paycheck whether the film succeeded or not. He could leave if he wanted. Go work somewhere else. Walt couldn't leave. This was his life, his identity, and now his own people were trying to destroy it. During the strike, Walt did something revealing. He went to South America, a goodwill tour sponsored by the State Department, part of America's effort to strengthen ties with Latin American countries before the war. Walt took a group of animators and artists, the ones who hadn't struck, and they traveled through Brazil, Argentina, Chile, made sketches, collected ideas for films. It was diplomatic work, but it was also escape. Walt couldn't bear to be at the studio during the strike, couldn't watch his kingdom tear itself apart. So he left. Let Roy handle the negotiations. Let the lawyers and union representatives fight it out. When he came back, the strike was over. The union had won. The animators got better pay, got job security, got recognition. But the victory was Pyrrhic for everyone. The strikers had saved their jobs, but destroyed their relationship with Walt. And Walt had kept his studio, but lost his illusions about what it was. He would never again see Disney as a family. It was a corporation, a business, and he was management, and they were labor, and those roles were fundamentally opposed. Art Babbitt came back to work after the strike. The settlement required Disney to rehire him. For years, Walt had to see him in the halls, in meetings, this man who'd led the rebellion against him. Walt couldn't fire him. The union protected him. But he could make his life difficult, could give him unimportant assignments, could exclude him from major projects, could make clear through 1,000 small gestures that Babbitt was no longer welcome in the kingdom, even if he still worked there. Eventually, in 1947, Walt found a reason to fire Babbitt. A minor infraction, something technical, but enough to justify termination. Babbitt sued. The case dragged through courts for years. Walt spent money he could have used for films on lawyers, on fighting this one animator who'd become, in Walt's mind, the symbol of everything wrong with unions, with ingratitude, with betrayal. He won the case eventually, but winning meant nothing. The damage was done. The strike changed how Walt ran the studio. He became more distant from the animators, stopped visiting the animation floors as often, communicated through directors and supervisors rather than talking to animators directly. Built more hierarchy, more bureaucracy. The studio became more corporate, more impersonal, because intimacy had proven dangerous. Intimacy meant vulnerability, meant caring about people who might turn on you. He also became more political, more conservative. He'd never been particularly political before the strike, had focused on work, on art, on building his company. But the strike radicalized him, made him see communism everywhere, made him suspicious of unions, of government regulation, of anything that limited his control. He testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, named people he thought were communists in the film industry. Some of those people lost their careers. Walt believed he was protecting America, protecting the studio. But he was also settling scores, punishing people who'd opposed him. His testimony revealed something about how he saw himself. He wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a patriot, a defender of American values. And those values included free enterprise, individual achievement, the right to build something without interference from workers or government, or anyone else. Walt Disney had risen from poverty through talent and work and risk-taking. He'd built an empire himself. And anyone who tried to limit that, to regulate it, to make him share power or credit or control, they were the enemy. They were un-American. This mindset would shape the last 20 years of his life, would influence what he built, how he built it, who he trusted. The strike didn't just change Disney the company. It changed Walt the man, made him harder, more isolated, more convinced that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. And that conviction, that isolation, would drive him toward increasingly ambitious projects, increasingly impossible dreams. Because if he couldn't trust people, he'd have to trust vision. Had to build things so big, so undeniable that their existence was proof he'd been right all along. But first, he had to survive the war. Had to keep the studio alive through years when art didn't matter, and only propaganda and training films and cheap package features kept the doors open. Had to watch his animators go off to fight, some of them never coming back. Had to accept that the world had changed, that innocence was gone, that the America he'd known before the war was dead, and something stranger, more complicated, was taking its shape. Chapter 10, The War and After. The day after Pearl Harbor, the military arrived at the Disney studio. 700 soldiers. They didn't ask permission. They requisitioned the soundstage, the parking garage, the repair shops, set up anti-aircraft guns on the roof. The studio became a garrison. Walt watched soldiers patrol his property. watched them turn his buildings into military infrastructure, and understood that nothing belonged to him anymore. Not really. Not when the nation was at war. The government contracts came immediately. Training films, insignia designs for military units, educational shorts about everything from aircraft recognition to food rationing. Walt's studio, which had spent a decade perfecting the art of animated fairy tales, was now making cartoons about how to identify Japanese Zero fighters and why soldiers shouldn't drink contaminated water. Some of this work was important, genuinely useful. The military needed ways to train millions of young men quickly, and animated films were efficient educational tools. Walt could tell himself this mattered, that he was contributing to the war effort. That entertainment could be set aside for national survival, but it still felt like defeat. He'd spent years fighting to elevate animation into art, and now he was back to making utilitarian cartoons, the kind of work he'd done at the Kansas City Film Ad Company when he was 20 years old. The studio made over 60,000 feet of film for the military during the war years. Hundreds of hours of content. Most of it was classified. Soldiers saw it, learned from it, then it disappeared into military archives. No theatrical release, no acclaim. Work that existed and then vanished. Walt kept the studio running, kept people employed, but creatively, he was starving. He tried to maintain feature animation, started development on Bambi before the war, finished it in 1942, poured himself into it. The film was quieter than anything Disney had made, more contemplative. The forest scenes were lush, detailed, almost photographic. The animals moved with real weight and grace. Bambi's mother's death was handled with devastating restraint. No dramatic music, just Bambi calling for her in the snow, his voice getting smaller, and silence. Walt was proud of Bambi, thought it was maybe the best animation the studio had ever done. But audiences in 1942 didn't want gentle stories about deer. They wanted escapism or patriotism. Bambi was neither. It was sad and beautiful and slow. It made some money, but not nearly enough to recoup its cost. Another expensive failure. Another proof that what Walt wanted to make and what audiences wanted to see weren't always the same thing. So he made propaganda. Der Führer's Face in 1943. Donald Duck having a nightmare about living in Nazi Germany. Waking up grateful to be American. It was crude. Obvious. The kind of thing Walt would have dismissed as hack work before the war. But it won an Academy Award. Audiences loved it, needed to laugh at Hitler, to feel superior to the enemy, to believe the war had a clear moral purpose. Walt made Victory Through Air Power in 1944, a feature-length film advocating for strategic bombing of Japan and Germany. It was based on a book by Alexander de Seversky, an aviation theorist who believed wars could be won through air superiority. Walt believed it too, or wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that technology and strategy could win wars cleanly without the grinding horror of ground combat. The film mixed live action and animation, showed maps and diagrams and dramatic visualizations of bombers destroying enemy infrastructure. It was propaganda, but Walt convinced himself it was more, that it was educational, important, a contribution to military strategy. He showed the film to Winston Churchill, to Franklin Roosevelt, to military planners. Some of them were impressed. Others thought Walt was overstepping, that a cartoon maker shouldn't be advising generals. The film lost money. Audiences didn't want feature-length lectures about air power, but Walt had needed to make it, needed to feel like he was contributing something more significant than training films about malaria prevention. The war dragged on, 1943, 1944. Most of Walt's best animators were overseas, fighting in Europe, fighting in the Pacific. Some of them sent letters back to the studio, described what they were seeing, the destruction, the death. Walt read the letters and felt helpless. He was 42, 43, 44. Too old to fight. Too important to the studio to leave. He was doing his part making films, but it felt inadequate, abstract. While young men he'd trained were dying, he was safe in Burbank, arguing about animation timing. He worked constantly during the war years, 16-hour days, smoking 3 packs a day, drinking bourbon in the evenings to unwind. He lost weight, looked gaunt. The stress of keeping the studio afloat, of managing military contracts and budgets and a skeleton crew, ground him down. Lillian barely saw him. The girls barely saw him. He was always at the office, always working, always carrying the weight of a company that might collapse if he stopped moving. When the war ended in August 1945, Walt was 43. The studio had survived. Barely. They were in debt, but functioning. The animators started coming back from overseas. But they were different. Everyone was different. The country was different. The innocence of the 1930s. The belief that animation could transport people to magical kingdoms where evil queens were the worst thing to fear. That was gone. Everyone had seen too much. Knew too much. The world was more complicated than fairy tales allowed. Walt tried to restart feature animation, started work on Cinderella, but the studio was cautious now. Couldn't afford another expensive failure like Pinocchio or Fantasia or Bambi. They had to be smarter, more commercial, had to make films that would definitely make money, not films that were artistic experiments. The era of innovation was over. The era of careful calculation had begun. In the meantime, Walt made package features, Make Mine music, fun and fancy-free, Melody Time, collections of shorts bundled into feature length. They were fine, professional, but they felt like treading water, like waiting for permission to make real films again. Walt was bored, frustrated. He'd spent 4 years making training films and propaganda. Now he was spending more years making package features that nobody would remember. Cinderella finally came out in 1950, 5 years after the war ended. It was a return to the Snow White formula. Princess, fairy godmother, wicked stepmother, animal sidekicks, romance, happy ending. The studio needed it to succeed. If Cinderella failed, they'd have to shut down the animation department. Liquidate. Become a live-action studio only. Everything Walt had built, the entire legacy of Disney animation, depended on whether audiences still wanted fairy tales. They did. Cinderella was a massive hit, made millions, saved the studio, proved that the formula worked, princesses worked, romance worked, happy endings worked. Audiences wanted comfort, wanted escape, wanted the world to be simpler than it actually was. And Disney could provide that, could manufacture that, could do it efficiently and profitably. But for Walt, the success felt hollow. Cinderella was good, professional, exactly what it needed to be. But it wasn't new, wasn't innovative. It was a repeat of Snow White, just with different characters. And if the formula worked, the studio would keep using it, would keep making princess films, keep making safe choices, keep giving audiences what they wanted rather than what Walt wanted to create. He started pulling away from animation, started focusing on live-action films. Treasure Island in 1950, The Story of Robin Hood in 1952. Both successful, both less labor-intensive than animation. Live action was faster, cheaper, easier to control. You could shoot a scene and see immediately if it worked. Animation required months of drawing, testing, revising. By the time you knew whether something worked, you'd already spent a fortune on it. Walt also started working on television. The Disneyland show launched in 1954, an hour every week on ABC. Walt hosted it himself, appeared on camera, spoke directly to viewers, became America's uncle. Warm, Trustworthy? Safe? He was good at it. Better than he'd expected. Television was immediate. You made something, and it aired a week later. You could see the response, adjust, try new things. Animation took years between conception and release. By the time a film came out, Walt had moved on to other ideas. Television kept him engaged. But he was restless. Nothing satisfied him. Animation was repetitive. Live action was fine, but felt like someone else's medium. Television was engaging but ephemeral. Nothing had the weight, the permanence, the sense of building something monumental that Snow White had had. He'd spent 20 years since Snow White trying to recapture that feeling, and he couldn't, because Snow White had been impossible. Everyone said it couldn't be done, and Walt did it anyway. Everything since then had been possible. Difficult, but possible. And possible wasn't enough. Walt needed impossible. He started thinking about the park, not seriously at first, just idle thoughts, sketches. What if there was a place where families could experience Disney stories in 3 dimensions, where you could walk through a fairy tale, where everything was clean and safe and controlled, not like the dirty carnivals and amusement parks that existed, a place that was permanent, physical, real. The idea grew, consumed him. By 1952, 1953, he was spending more time thinking about the park than about films. Was sketching layouts? Was visiting amusement parks and carnivals to see what worked, what didn't, what needed to be different. Was imagining lands, a western frontier, a fantasy castle, a journey through history. Was thinking about how to make imagination tangible. Everyone thought he was crazy. Roy thought he was crazy. Lillian thought he was crazy. Amusement parks were low class, dangerous, financial traps. They failed constantly. Why would Walt risk everything he'd built on a carnival? But Walt couldn't explain it in a way they'd understand. He needed to build something that wasn't a film, wasn't temporary, wasn't just images on a screen. Something that would last. Something that would be his. Completely, undeniably his. He was 52 years old. He'd survived poverty, bankruptcy, theft, strikes, war, the slow death of his creative ambitions. He'd built an empire and discovered the empire was hollow, was profitable but meaningless. And now, at an age when most men were thinking about retirement, about slowing down, Walt Disney was planning to build a kingdom, an actual physical kingdom, in an orange grove in Southern California, with money he didn't have, against the advice of everyone who cared about him. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly what he needed. Chapter 11, The Park. There's a moment, somewhere in 1953, when Walt Disney is standing in an orange grove in Anaheim, California. It's hot. The air smells like citrus and dust. There's nothing here, just trees and empty land stretching toward the horizon. 160 acres of nothing. And Walt is trying to explain to the landowner why this nothing is going to become the most visited destination in America. The landowner is skeptical. Everyone is skeptical. Walt has been trying to finance this park for 2 years, and every bank he approaches tells him the same thing. Amusement parks are bad investments. They're dirty. They attract the wrong kind of people. They fail within a few years. Why would anyone lend millions of dollars to build something that's statistically likely to fail? Walt tries to explain that this will be different. Not an amusement park. A theme park. Everything designed around stories, around immersion, around making people feel like they've stepped into another world. He talks about Main Street, USA, a nostalgic recreation of small-town America at the turn of the century. About Frontierland, the Old West. About Fantasyland, where children can walk through Sleeping Beauty's castle. About Tomorrowland, a vision of the future. About Adventureland, exotic jungles and pirates and exploration. The bankers don't understand. They see rides and concession stands and operational costs. They see liability. They see risk. They don't see what Walt sees, which is something that doesn't exist yet. A place where fantasy becomes physical, where you don't just watch a Disney story, you enter it, you walk through it, you become part of it. Roy refuses to let the studio finance it. The studio is stable now, making money from films and television and licensing. Roy won't risk that stability on Walt's carnival dream. So Walt creates a separate company, WED Enterprises. Walt Elias Disney. His initials, his project. He mortgages his house, his life insurance policy, everything he personally owns, he borrows from friends. He uses his own money, separate from the studio, to start designing the park. He hires artists. Imagineers, he calls them. A combination of imagination and engineering. They're not just designing rides, they're designing experiences, narratives. Walt wants every detail to tell a story. The trash cans should look right for whatever land they're in. The costumes should be authentic. The plants should match the theme. Nothing should break the illusion. No visible modern world. No intrusion of reality. ABC Television offers a deal. They'll help finance the park in exchange for a television show, the Disneyland Show. An hour every week promoting the park, showing behind-the-scenes footage, building anticipation. Walt agrees. It's not enough money, but it's something. It's a start. The show premieres in October 1954. Millions of Americans watch Walt Disney standing in front of a model of the park, explaining what he's going to build. He's selling a dream that doesn't exist yet, selling it so convincingly that people believe it will. Construction begins in July 1954, 1 year before the scheduled opening. It's an insane timeline. You can't build a theme park in a year, can't construct multiple lands, dozens of attractions, infrastructure for thousands of visitors per day in 12 months. But Walt has promised ABC, has promised the public, has bet everything on opening in July 1955. So they build. The construction is chaos. Walt is on site constantly, changing plans, redesigning attractions, demanding authenticity. The Matterhorn bobsled ride, one of the first tubular steel roller coasters ever built, is too expensive. They cut it. Then Walt insists they include it. They add it back. The castle is too small. They redesign it. The Jungle Cruise needs real-looking animals. They sculpt them, paint them, make them move mechanically. Nothing is simple. Everything costs more than projected. Walt is impossible to work with during construction. He wants everything perfect, genuine. If something looks fake, he tears it out, makes them start over. The Mark Twain riverboat has to be a real working steamboat, not just a facade. The trains that circle the park have to be authentic, functioning locomotives. The buildings on Main Street have forced perspective, smaller on the upper floors to make them look taller. But the construction has to be real. No shortcuts, no cheap substitutes. The money runs out. Again. Walt borrows more, sells assets, convinces suppliers to extend credit. He's 53 years old, deeply in debt, building something everyone says will fail. His brother thinks he's destroying everything they've built. His wife thinks he's having a breakdown. His employees think he's obsessed beyond reason. But Walt can't stop. This is what he's been searching for. Not a film, not images on a screen. Something permanent, something real. Opening day is set for July 17th, 1955, a Sunday. ABC will broadcast it live. Millions will watch. Media from around the world will attend. Everything has to be perfect. Everything has to work. 2 weeks before opening, the park is a construction site. Unfinished buildings, unpaved streets, rides that haven't been tested. Walt is panicking. They're not going to make it. It's going to be a disaster, a public humiliation. They work around the clock those final 2 weeks, paving Main Street the night before opening, installing the final attractions hours before the gates open, painting, planting, finishing. At 4:30 a.m. on opening day, they're still working. The park isn't finished, isn't ready, but the cameras are coming, the crowds are coming. Ready or not, Disneyland opens at 10 a.m. The opening is a catastrophe. Tickets are counterfeited. 28,000 people show up when the park was designed for 15,000. The crowd overwhelms everything. Lines are hours long. Rides break down. The asphalt on Main Street is so fresh it's still soft. Women's high heels sink into it. The drinking fountains don't work because the plumbers union was on strike, and Walt had to choose between working fountains and working toilets. He chose toilets. The Mark Twain riverboat is overloaded and starts to sink. The park runs out of food. The temperature hits over 100 degrees. Walt walks through it all, watching his dream collapse in real time, watching people angry, exhausted, disappointed. He'd promised something magical, and he'd delivered crowds and broken rides and heat stroke. The press calls it Black Sunday, Disney's biggest failure. Proof that the park was always a terrible idea. But something else happens that day. Something Walt notices. The children are happy. Despite the heat and the lines and the chaos, the children are walking through Sleeping Beauty Castle with wonder on their faces. They're riding the Dumbo attraction and laughing. They're meeting Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse, real people in costumes, characters they can touch and hug, and they're crying with joy. The parents are miserable, but the children are experiencing something they've never experienced before. Magic made physical. Walt fixes everything. Over the next weeks and months, he fixes what broke on opening day, adds capacity, improves operations, trains the staff better, adjusts, refines, perfects. The park gets better. Word spreads. Despite the disastrous opening, people come. They keep coming. Lines stretch for hours, but people wait. They want to experience what Walt built, want to walk through a fairy tale, want to take their children somewhere safe and clean and magical. By the end of the first year, Disneyland has welcomed over 3 million visitors. It's profitable, extraordinarily profitable. The debt gets repaid. The critics who said it would fail go silent. Walt has done it again, has taken something everyone said was impossible and made it real. Made it work, made it undeniable. But more than the financial success, the park gives Walt something he hasn't felt in years: purpose. He walks through Disneyland constantly, rides the attractions, talks to guests, watches families, sees what works and what doesn't, imagines improvements, new attractions, new lands. The park isn't finished, can never be finished. It's a living thing that grows and changes. And that's perfect. That's what Walt needs. A project that never ends, that can't be completed and left behind. He spends more time at the park than at the studio. His office at Disney headquarters sits empty. He's in Anaheim, walking Main Street, eating lunch in the park, watching people. His animators feel abandoned. The studio is making films, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, but Walt barely involves himself. He's moved on. The park is his focus now, his obsession, his kingdom. And it's working. Disneyland becomes a cultural phenomenon, a destination. Families plan vacations around it. Politicians visit. International dignitaries tour it. The park becomes synonymous with America itself, with American optimism, American innovation, American fantasy. Walt has built something that transcends entertainment. He's built a place, a physical manifestation of imagination, and people love it. But Walt is already thinking bigger. One park isn't enough. Disneyland is constrained by its location, surrounded by cheap motels and tourist traps that Walt can't control. He needs more land, more space, A place where he can build not just a park, but an entire city. A vision of how the future could be. Should be. He starts looking east, looking at Florida, at empty land where he could build something even more impossible than Disneyland. His health is starting to fail. He's 54, 55. Smokes too much, works too much, ignores doctors' warnings. His neck hurts constantly, an old polo injury from years ago that never healed properly. He has sinus problems, breathing problems, but he doesn't slow down, can't slow down. There's too much to build, too much left to prove. Chapter 12, The Florida Project. In 1963, Walt Disney started buying land in Central Florida. Not himself, not obviously. He used shell corporations, dummy companies with names that meant nothing. Compass East Corporation, Latin American Development and Management Corporation, MT Lot Real Estate Investments. He bought the land in small parcels, quietly, so no one would realize what was happening, so the prices wouldn't skyrocket once people knew Disney was interested. He bought swampland, acres and acres of it, 27,000 acres eventually, 43 square miles, twice the size of Manhattan, empty Florida swamp, mosquito-infested, humid, worthless to most people. But Walt saw something else. He saw space, room to build not just a park, but a complete vision. A place where he could control everything. The hotels, the transportation, the infrastructure, the entire experience from the moment visitors arrived until the moment they left. The project had a code name, the Florida Project. Only a few people knew what Walt was planning. He kept it secret for 2 years while the land purchases continued. When the news finally broke in 1965, when reporters figured out Disney was behind the mysterious land buying, Walt held a press conference, announced his intentions, and what he described wasn't just a theme park. It was something stranger, something more ambitious. He wanted to build a city, an actual functioning city, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Epcot, not a tourist destination, a place where people lived and worked, a city designed from scratch, using the best technology and planning available. Underground utilities, climate-controlled environments, monorails instead of cars, industries partnering with research institutions, a living laboratory for urban planning. Walt stood in front of maps and models and explained his vision to skeptical reporters. Epcot would be a circle, 20,000 residents in the center, industries and businesses around the perimeter. No slums, no poverty, no urban decay, everything planned, everything controlled, everything perfect. The city would never be finished. As technology advanced, the city would evolve. Buildings would be replaced, systems updated. It would be a permanent World's Fair, a showcase for American innovation. People thought he'd lost his mind. A theme park was one thing, but a city? Walt Disney, who made cartoons and built Disneyland, was now proposing to solve urban planning? To create a utopia from scratch? It was megalomania. It was impossible. It was Walt being Walt, dreaming so big that reality bent to accommodate him or broke trying. But Walt believed it. Believed Epcot was the most important thing he would ever do. More important than Mickey Mouse. More important than Snow White. More important than Disneyland. Those were entertainment. Epcot would be a solution, a blueprint for how humanity could live better. In his vision, cities didn't have to be chaotic and dirty and crime-ridden. They could be ordered, beautiful, efficient, if you designed them correctly, if you controlled them completely. There's something revealing about Epcot, about what it says regarding who Walt had become. He'd started as an animator, someone who wanted to make drawings move. Then he became a filmmaker, someone who wanted to tell stories. Then he became a theme park designer, someone who wanted to make stories physical. And now he wanted to be a city planner, a social engineer. Someone who could design not just entertainment, but life itself. Could create an environment where people lived according to his vision of how things should be. It was controlling, deeply controlling. Epcot, as Walt envisioned it, would have no private property. No one would own their home. Everyone would rent from the Disney Corporation. There would be no retirees. If you stopped working, you'd have to leave. No voting for local government. Disney would control everything. It was benevolent totalitarianism, a kingdom where everyone was happy because every detail was managed by someone who knew better than they did what they needed. Walt didn't see the darkness in this. He saw efficiency, order, a place where his vision couldn't be corrupted by strikes or unions or people who didn't understand what he was trying to build. Epcot was the ultimate expression of everything he'd learned. If you controlled everything, nothing could go wrong. Nothing could be taken away. Nothing could fail. But he was running out of time. His health was deteriorating. The neck pain was constant. He developed a chronic cough. His doctor told him to quit smoking. Walt cut back but didn't quit. He was 63, 64, still working 16-hour days, still planning, designing, pushing forward. The Florida land was purchased. The plans for Epcot were developing, but construction hadn't started. Nothing physical existed yet, except swampland and blueprints. In November 1966, Walt flew to Florida, did a tour of the property, rode through the swamps in a boat, looking at the empty land, imagining what would be there. Hotels, parks, the city, transportation systems, a complete controlled environment. He was excited, more excited than he'd been about anything in years. This was it, the culmination of everything, the thing that would define his legacy. When he came back to California, he was exhausted, sick. The cough was worse. He went to the doctor. They found a spot on his lung, ran tests. The diagnosis came quickly. Lung cancer, advanced. He'd been smoking 3 packs a day for 40 years. His left lung was covered in tumors. They operated, removed the lung, told him the cancer had spread, told him there was nothing more they could do. Walt was 65 years old. He'd survived everything: poverty, bankruptcy, betrayal, strikes, war. He'd built an empire from nothing, had created characters and films and a theme park that millions loved, had plans for something even bigger, had finally figured out what he wanted to build. And now his body was failing. The cancer was killing him faster than the doctors expected. He spent his final weeks planning, couldn't stop planning. They brought maps and models to his hospital room. He'd lie there, weak, dying, pointing at locations on the Florida property, telling people where things should go, how Epcot should function, what the park, the Magic Kingdom they were calling it, should include. He was trying to finish the vision before he died, trying to give them enough direction that they could complete it without him. Roy visited him in the hospital. Roy, who'd been with him since the beginning, who'd managed the money while Walt dreamed, who'd bailed him out and fought with him and saved him more times than either of them could count. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. They'd said everything that needed saying over 40 years of partnership. Roy promised he'd finish the Florida project, would make sure Walt's vision was built. Walt nodded, believed him, had to believe him, because he wouldn't live to see it. On December 15th, 1966, Walt Disney died. Acute circulatory collapse. His body gave out. He was 65 years old, had been sick for barely 6 weeks, had gone from planning a city to dying in a hospital in less than 2 months. The world learned the next morning. The man who'd created Mickey Mouse, who'd made Snow White, who'd built Disneyland, he was gone. The tributes were immediate, overwhelming. World leaders issued statements. Newspapers ran obituaries that stretched for pages. He'd touched multiple generations, had been part of people's childhoods, their families' lives, had created something that felt permanent, eternal. And now he was dead, and people realized that the magic had come from a person, a man, someone mortal and flawed and gone. But what's strange is what people remember, what persists. The studio continued. Roy stayed on, kept the company running, made sure the Florida project happened. Walt Disney World opened in 1971, 5 years after Walt died. Roy stood there at the dedication, 78 years old, making sure everyone knew this was Walt's dream, that Walt had planned it, that the kingdom they were standing in was Walt's vision made real. The theme parks became more popular than the films, became what Disney meant to most people. Mickey Mouse remained iconic, but Disneyland, Disney World, and the parks, those became Walt's legacy. Physical kingdoms that people could visit, places that felt permanent, even though everything in them was constantly changing, constantly being replaced and updated and reimagined. And Epcot. It was built, but not as Walt envisioned, not as a city, as another theme park. A permanent World's Fair showcasing technology and culture. No residents, no industries, no utopian urban planning, just another destination. Another attraction. The city Walt wanted to build. The solution to urban problems. The blueprint for how humanity could live. That died with him because no one else had the vision or the megalomania or the belief that one person could design how everyone else should live. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe Walt's Epcot would have been a disaster. A controlling nightmare where people lived under corporate management, where every detail of life was engineered and surveilled and optimized. Or maybe it would have worked. Maybe Walt could have solved problems other cities couldn't. We'll never know. The city remained imaginary. Only the parks became real. Chapter 13, The End. There's a photograph. There are always photographs of Walt Disney in the last year of his life, standing in the shadow of his own constructions. He's in a suit. He's smiling the practiced television smile, the one that says, "Trust me," the one that made mothers comfortable and children attentive. But if you stare at it long enough, you can see the fatigue underneath, like a pencil line that didn't get erased all the way. The smile is there. The eyes are somewhere else. In the story people like to tell, Walt Disney dies, and the magic continues. The castle still stands. The music still plays. The mouse still waves. That story is comforting because it suggests the dream is bigger than the dreamer, that the dream was never really about a man at all. But the truth is more complicated, and complication is what the people spend their whole lives trying to sand down into something smooth. Walt died on December 15th, 1966, in a hospital room in Burbank. The official cause was acute circulatory collapse, which is the kind of phrase doctors use when they don't want the sentence to feel like a punch. His lung cancer, advanced, fast, ruthless, had made the rest inevitable. He was 65 years old. He had been sick for weeks, not years. There wasn't a long fade out. There wasn't time for a grand acceptance, a dignified final act. 1 month, he's mapping Florida in his mind. The next month, he's gone. A man who had always believed in control died in a way that proved control was an illusion. And yet, because he was Walt Disney, even his death became a kind of story people argued about. Rumors sprouted like weeds in the wake of grief, that he was frozen, that he wasn't really gone, that he'd found a way to cheat the ending the way he cheated contracts and bankers and physics and common sense. It's a myth that says more about the audience than the man. People wanted him to be immortal because his work had trained them to expect happy endings. But immortality isn't a freezer. It isn't a trick. It's what happens when strangers decide your name belongs to them now. The studio didn't stop. It couldn't. Disney was a machine by then. an engine of payroll and contracts and brands and obligations. And machines don't pause for morning. People came to work, meetings happened, projects moved forward. There were board members to answer to, shareholders to please, schedules to keep. The dream had already become a factory, and factories don't care who built them. The question was never whether Disney would survive Walt. The question was, what kind of Disney would survive? Roy took over the part of Walt's life he'd always taken over. The business, the money, the solvency. Roy had spent 4 decades being the quiet spine behind his brother's imagination. He'd been the one saying we can't, the one saying not yet, the one counting the cost, while Walt demanded the impossible anyway. He was older now, 70s, tired in the way men get tired when they've spent their whole adulthood bracing for the next disaster. But he did what he'd always done. He held the thing together. And he made a promise into something physical. Florida was already underway. The land was purchased, the secrecy was gone, the plans existed. The swamp had been mapped and measured and dreamed over. What Florida didn't have anymore was the man who could walk into a room and make everyone believe in the impossible simply by refusing to accept the word no. So, Roy became the translator. He took Walt's vision, fragments, models, speeches, directives delivered through painkillers, and turned it into something buildable. Not the utopia, not the city, the park. Because the parks were the part of Walt's dreaming that could be sold as tickets. Epcot, the city, the living laboratory, the benevolent dictatorship of the future. That version required Walt alive. It required his appetite for control, his ability to ignore moral ambiguity in the name of efficiency, his conviction that if you designed people's environment carefully enough, you could design away their failures. Nobody else wanted to inherit that responsibility. Nobody else wanted to argue in public that a corporation should own a city and decide who gets to live there. So, they built Epcot as spectacle instead of governance, a World's Fair instead of a world. It's hard not to see the symbolism in that. When Walt died, his boldest dream became entertainment. The thing he wanted most, the thing he insisted would matter beyond movies and rides, was the first thing everyone quietly agreed to soften. And maybe that, too, says something about what his dreams were always made of. Because Walt's whole life was a negotiation between 2 impulses that never fully reconciled. One impulse was wonder, the farm boy drawing animals that smiled, the teenager sketching in Paris, the young animator staying late to photograph drawings into motion, the man who looked at sound, at color, at depth, at a feature-length cartoon, at an orange grove, and saw not risk, but possibility. The other impulse was fear. The father's violence, the route at 3:30 a.m., the bankruptcy, the betrayal in New York, the strike line outside the studio, the repeated lesson that the world takes things from you, that people leave, that ownership is fragile, that safety is a myth. Walt built wonder like a fortress. That's the part people don't like to say out loud. Disneyland wasn't just a place for families. It was a controlled environment, clean, ordered, designed, curated. Trash disappears quickly. Bad behavior is handled quietly. The outside world is kept outside. The park is not reality, it's managed reality. A place where chaos is edited out the way he'd always wanted to edit it out of his own life. He didn't just want to entertain people. He wanted to protect them by controlling what they experienced. Protection and control look identical from far enough away. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The older he got, the more the control mattered. The more he seemed to want a world where nothing could surprise him, hurt him, embarrass him, or take from him again. A world where every moving part had a place, every place had a purpose, and every purpose served the story. A world where strikes couldn't happen. A world where betrayal couldn't happen. A world where the boy in the barn never had to be afraid. If you've ever watched a Disney film as an adult, really watched it, not as nostalgia, but as text, you can sometimes feel that tension humming underneath. The insistence on order, the neatness of morality, the cleanliness of endings, the sense that if you work hard and stay good and keep up believing, the universe will reward you. That the world can be made safe if you commit hard enough to the idea of safety. It's a beautiful lie. It's also a lie. And Walt knew it was a lie. That's why he kept building. He kept building because building was the only time the lie felt temporarily true. After he died, people asked whether the empire transcended him or whether it had always been another kind of cage. That question sounds philosophical, but it's actually very practical. It's the question of whether what Walt made freed anyone, himself included, or whether it simply replaced one set of constraints with another. Instead of a father's violence, a schedule. Instead of poverty, debt. Instead of Kansas City, Burbank. Instead of a newspaper route, a production line. Instead of a barn before dawn, an office light that never went out. His dream wasn't freedom. His dream was control with joy. A safe place where the rules are pleasant. Maybe that's what everyone wants, if they're honest. But control doesn't stop wanting more control. It metastasizes. It grows. It becomes a company. Then a brand. Then a global identity. Then a meaning people argue about in courtrooms and boardrooms and culture wars and childhood bedrooms. Then it becomes something you can't personally steer because it's too large to be steered by a single human being. The most profound irony of Walt Disney's life is that he became what he spent his childhood trying to escape: an unstoppable system. A machine that demanded work, that demanded faith, that demanded repetition, that demanded constant growth, that punished slowing down, that devoured the hours, the relationships, the body, that promised safety and delivered pressure. He built a kingdom, and then he lived inside it. And when he died, the kingdom didn't die with him, because kingdoms are designed to outlast kings. That's the point of building one. That's why you build castles instead of tents. But kingdoms change when the king is gone. The people who came after Walt kept the brand. They kept the iconography. They kept the promise. They kept the idea of Disney as comfort, as family, as innocence. They kept the smile. They also kept the business. Because business is the part that survives grief. In the decades after his death, the company would grow into something Walt could barely have imagined in scale. More parks, more films, more characters, more acquisitions, more reach. Disney would become less like a studio and more like a language, a global shorthand for childhood, a powerful force that could shape what stories look like, what dreams look like, what happiness is supposed to feel like. That's transcendence in a sense. It's also something else, a kind of permanence that looks like safety until you remember that permanence is just another word for inescapable. Somewhere in Florida, the place he bought in secret, the swamp he turned into architecture, people still walk down a main street designed to resemble a past that never really existed. They eat ice cream. They buy ears. They take photos in front of a castle. They laugh. They cry. They propose marriage. They hold their children's hands and feel for a day like nothing bad can reach them here. And for a day, mostly, it can't. That is Walt Disney's greatest achievement. Not animation, not the mouse, not even the parks. It's the feeling. The manufactured, carefully engineered feeling of safety. The boy who learned safety was an illusion, grew into a man who sold the illusion better than anyone who ever lived. So, was it a cage? Maybe. For him, certainly. A cage made of ambition and control, and debt and expectation. With bars so gilded, people mistook them for sunlight. He couldn't stop. He couldn't rest. He couldn't trust the world enough to let it be imperfect. He chased the impossible until the impossible chased him back, and his body finally did what bodies do. It refused to negotiate. But was it transcendence? Also, yes, because a cage can be a shelter, depending on who's looking at it, because the same structure that trapped him gave millions of people a place to put their longing, because his work outlived him in the only way art can outlive anyone, by becoming part of other people's lives. There's a line you could draw from the barn in Marceline to the hospital room in Burbank. A straight line, clean, logical. Trauma creates ambition. Ambition creates empire. Empire consumes creator. Creator dies, empire remains. But Walt's life wasn't a straight line. It was animation, frame by frame, redrawing the world until it moved the way he needed it to move. And maybe that's the final truth. Walt Disney didn't build a perfect world. He built a world where perfection could be rehearsed, where happiness could be staged, where endings could be controlled, where a boy could step into a story and, for a few hours, believe the world was safe. For the boy he once was, that might have been enough. For the man he became, it never was. And that's why the question remains, even now, long after the credits rolled. Did he build something that transcended him? Or did he simply build a bigger, brighter version of the same old escape? A dream so vast, it became its own kind of reality. A kingdom so magical, it convinced the world to forget it, that it was underneath, still made of work, still made of fear, still made of a boy in a barn before dawn, learning that dreams were the only place he could go where his father couldn't follow.